February 23rd, 1944. 22,000 feet above the German Reich. The morning sun carves through the thin air like a blade of gold, illuminating the aluminum skin of 316 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses as they drone eastward in perfect formation. In the lead aircraft of the 100th Bomb Group, co-pilot Lieutenant Robert "Rosie" Rosenthal grips his controls with hands that know death intimately. Below, the snow-covered fields of Bavaria stretch endlessly, innocent and pastoral. Above, contrails etch white lines against the azure sky, signatures of American ambition written in exhaust and ice. The engines throb with mechanical certainty, drowning out the whispered prayers of 10 men per bomber. 3,160 souls suspended between heaven and earth, carrying death in their bellies and hope in their hearts. This is Operation Argument. The Americans call it Big Week. For the young Luftwaffe pilots scrambling from their bases below, watching those silver specks grow larger in their gun sights, it will become something else entirely. The morning. They learned that flying fortresses could indeed live up to their name. The concept seemed so simple when the Boeing engineers first christened their creation in 1935. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a T-24, name born from a reporter's casual observation of the prototype's bristling gun positions. 9 machine guns on the early models, 13 on the latest G variants, each 50 caliber Browning capable of spitting 2-ounce bullets at 2,040 feet per second. The mathematics were seductive. Multiply 13 guns by 36 aircraft in a combat wing, and you have 468 weapons firing simultaneously. Nearly 6,000 rounds per minute, a wall of lead that should, in theory, make any fighter pilot think twice about approaching. But mathematics on paper rarely account for the human heart under fire. And in the winter of 1944, both American bombers and German fighters were about to discover what their respective machines could truly withstand. For Obergefreiter Klaus Mitusch of Jagdgeschwader 26, the morning briefing had been routine. Intelligence reported another American bomber stream forming over England, probably 300 aircraft, destination likely the aircraft factories at Augsburg or Regensburg. The same targets the Americans had been hammering for months. Mitusch had faced flying fortresses before. Shot down 2, in fact. Big, slow, predictable targets. Certainly well-armed, but manageable if you knew their weak spots. He had studied the intelligence diagrams that showed the B-17's defensive fire coverage. Areas of overlap where the gunners could bring multiple weapons to bear, and the crucial blind spots where a nimble fighter could slip through. The fortress looked formidable, with machine gun barrels protruding from turrets and windows like the spines of some mechanical hedgehog. But every hedgehog had soft spots if you knew where to strike. The nose was weak until they added that chin turret. Attacks from directly above were effective if you could dive fast enough. Head-on passes, though terrifying, offered the best chance of hitting something vital. The cockpit, the bomb bay, the fuel tanks nestled in the wing roots. What Mitusch couldn't know, climbing into the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190 that crystal-clear February morning, was that American doctrine had evolved beyond his intelligence reports. The combat boxes were tighter now, the formations deeper. Instead of 18 bombers flying in loose trail, the Americans had learned to stack 54 aircraft into a single wing formation. High squadron, lead squadron, low squadron, creating not just overlapping fields of fire, but something approaching a 3-dimensional fortress of interlocking steel. As the German fighters climbed to altitude, their radios crackled with the positions of the incoming bomber stream. 3 combat wings, nearly 200 aircraft in the first wave alone. For a moment, the veteran pilots felt that familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with dread. No matter how many times you flew into combat, the body remembered what the mind tried to forget, that every mission might be your last. But confidence dies hard in the young. Miotush checked his ammunition count. 250 rounds for each of his four 20mm cannons, 475 rounds for each of his two 13mm machine guns. The Luftwaffe had calculated that 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells were sufficient to destroy a B-17. His Focke-Wulf could fire 130 rounds in a 3-second burst. Gun camera analysis showed that the average pilot achieved only a 2% hit rate, meaning he would need to fire 500 rounds to score the necessary 20 hits. He had 1,000 rounds total. By the mathematics of war, he should be able to destroy 2 bombers if he fired perfectly. Mathematics, however, rarely survived contact with the enemy. The first indication that this morning would be different came when the German fighters spotted the American formation at 30,000 feet. Even from 10 miles away, the sight was sobering. Not the loose gaggle of bombers they had grown accustomed to intercepting, but something that looked like a moving city in the sky. The lead wing stretched nearly a mile from front to back, 600 yards wide, half a mile deep. Behind it, separated by precise intervals, came 2 more identical formations, 900 aircraft in total, each one a 4-engine steel fortress bristling with guns. "Mein Gott," whispered Hauptmann Fritz Losigkeit over the radio. "They're like a flying porcupine." But it was worse than a porcupine. As the German fighters began their approach, climbing to position themselves for their traditional head-on attack, the American gunners opened fire at ranges that had never been effective before. Streams of 50-caliber tracers arced out from the bomber formations like deadly fireworks, red streaks that seemed to hang in the air, searching, probing, reaching for German fighters still 2 miles away. This was the transformation the Luftwaffe pilots couldn't have anticipated. American gunners had been training too. Months of combat had taught them to fire early and often, not to destroy attacking fighters at extreme range, but to disrupt their attacks, to make them flinch, to force them to break formation before they could deliver concentrated fire. The streams of tracers weren't meant to kill. They were meant to terrify. And they worked. In the cockpit of his Messerschmitt 109, Lieutenant Franz Stiegler watched red tracers stream past his canopy like angry hornets. He had flown over 500 combat missions, survived attacks by P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires, but nothing had prepared him for this barrage of defensive fire. The tracers seemed to fill the sky around him, creating a corridor of death that he had to fly through to reach the bombers. Every instinct screamed at him to break away, to dive out of the kill zone, to live to fight another day. But discipline held. The attack had to be pressed home. Germany's aircraft factories were running at full capacity, but they couldn't replace pilots as quickly as airframes. Every bomber that made it through to the target meant more weeks of delay in producing the jets and rockets that might yet turn the tide of war. The mathematics were different now. Not how many bombers his squadron could shoot down, but how many his squadron could prevent from reaching their targets. The German fighters pressed their attack, diving through the storm of defensive fire with their cannons blazing. At 350 yards per second closing speed, they had perhaps 2 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before ramming their targets. Some pilots, overwhelmed by the walls of tracer fire, broke away too early. Others, determined to press their attacks home, flew too close and paid the ultimate price. Mitush's first pass netted him hits on a B-17 in the high squadron. He saw his 20mm shells spark against the bomber's wing root, watched smoke trail from the No. 3 engine. But the fortress held formation, its gunners still firing, still adding their weapons to the defensive barrage. As he pulled up and around for another attack, he could see that his target, though damaged, was not falling. The self-sealing fuel tanks had done their job. The redundant systems kept the aircraft flying. This was the cruel mathematics of attrition warfare. The Luftwaffe had calculated that it took an average of 20-20mm hits to destroy a B-17. But the Americans had built their bombers to absorb punishment. Multiple fuel tanks, so that puncturing one wouldn't drain them all. 4 engines, so that losing one wouldn't end the mission. Compartmentalized design, so that damage to the tail wouldn't affect the controls in the nose. The Flying Fortress had been designed not just to carry bombs, but to survive long enough to deliver them. As the air battle developed over Bavaria, a new sound began to emerge above the roar of engines and the chatter of machine guns. It was the sound of aluminum being shredded by high-explosive shells, of fuel lines rupturing, of hydraulic systems failing. But strangely, it wasn't coming primarily from the American formations. The concentrated defensive fire of the bomber streams was taking its toll on the attacking fighters. The Germans had trained to attack bombers flying in small, loose formations. They had developed tactics for dealing with a dozen aircraft, perhaps 18 in a combat box. But 300 bombers flying in mutually supporting formations created something unprecedented. A volume of defensive fire so intense that it became almost impossible to penetrate without catastrophic losses. Hauptmann Losigkeit watched 2 of his pilots go down on the first pass. Unteroffizier Weber's 109 simply disintegrated in a hail of 50-caliber bullets, its wing folding back against the fuselage before the entire aircraft tumbled toward Earth in a shower of burning fragments. Feldwebel Hartmann's Focke-Wulf took a burst from a tail gunner that severed the pilot's head from his shoulders. The fighter continued, flying straight and level for nearly 30 seconds before slowly rolling over and diving into the ground. For the German pilots, this was a revelation as profound as it was terrifying. The individual bombers were still vulnerable. They could be shot down with concentrated fire. But the formations had achieved something approaching invulnerability through mutual protection. It was like trying to attack a single animal in a vast herd, only to discover that the entire herd could strike back simultaneously. In the lead B-17 of the 100th Bomb Group, Lieutenant Rosenthal felt the aircraft shudder as German fighters dove through his formation. The top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike Popovich, was firing in sustained bursts, his twin 50s sending streams of tracers into the attacking fighters. Over the intercom, Rosenthal could hear the excited chatter of his gunners calling out targets, directions, hits. Fighter at 2 o'clock high. Got him! Got him! He's smoking! Another one coming in at 11 o'clock level. But what struck Rosenthal most was not the excitement in his crew's voices, but the confidence. These men had been flying combat missions for months. They had seen their friends die, had watched bombers go down in flames, had counted the empty bunks back at base. But they had also learned something that the pre-war planners could never have anticipated. That when flying fortresses truly flew together, they became something more than the sum of their parts. The Americans had stumbled onto one of the fundamental principles of defensive warfare. That individual vulnerability could be overcome through mutual support. A single B-17, caught alone by German fighters, was almost certainly doomed. But 36 B-17s flying in tight formation created overlapping fields of fire that could reach out in every direction, creating a defensive envelope that grew stronger the closer the bombers flew to each other. This transformation was reflected in the changing vocabulary of combat. German pilots had initially nicknamed American bombers fat dogs or heavy babies, terms that suggested large, slow, easy targets. But by 1944, they were using different words. The bomber formations were called polks, herds. The tight combat boxes were flying porcupines. The entire bomber stream was sometimes referred to as the fortress wall. It was this last term that captured what was happening over Bavaria that February morning. The Americans had not just built flying fortresses, they had learned to make their fortresses fly together, creating defensive walls in the sky that German fighters found increasingly difficult to penetrate. But the most profound change was psychological. For 2 years, German fighter pilots had engaged American bombers with confidence born of experience. They knew the bombers' weak points, understood their limitations, had developed tactics that could exploit their vulnerabilities. Suddenly, in the span of a single mission, all that experience seemed obsolete. Lieutenant Stiegler, making his third attack pass of the morning, found himself flying through what he later described as a tunnel of tracers. Red streams of .50 caliber fire reached out from dozens of bombers simultaneously, creating corridors of death that seemed impossible to navigate. The closing speed was too fast for accurate shooting, but too slow for survival. As he fired his cannons and broke away, he realized that he had hit his target multiple times, but couldn't tell if he had inflicted serious damage. The bomber was still flying, still in formation, still adding its guns to the defensive barrage. This was the cruel irony of the air war over Europe. Both sides had achieved remarkable technological and tactical sophistication. German fighters were faster, more maneuverable, better armed than ever before. But American bombers had become more durable, better defended, more numerous. The result was not decisive victory for either side, but a grinding war of attrition in which both sides bled aircraft and, more importantly, irreplaceable trained air crews. For the German pilots engaging the American formations that morning, the most dispiriting realization was not that they were losing individual combats, but that they were fighting a battle they could not win through tactical excellence alone. No matter how skillfully they flew, how accurately they shot, how courageously they pressed their attacks, there were simply too many bombers flying too close together, with too much defensive firepower. As the running battle continued eastward toward the target, the psychological pressure began to tell on both sides. For the German fighters, each attack pass became a journey through an increasingly dense wall of defensive fire. Pilots, who had once pressed their attacks to point-blank range, now found themselves breaking away earlier, firing from longer distances, accepting lower hit probabilities in exchange for better survival odds. For the American bomber crews, the experience was equally transformative, though in the opposite direction. Months of flying through flak and fighter attacks had taught them that survival depended not just on their individual aircraft's defensive capabilities, but on maintaining formation discipline. Bombers that fell behind or strayed from formation were picked off by German fighters like wolves, separating weak animals from the herd. But bombers that held their positions, even when damaged, could continue to contribute to the collective defense. The symbol of this transformation was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something much simpler: the formation itself. The tight combat boxes that American bombers had learned to fly represented more than tactical innovation. They were a physical manifestation of American industrial democracy. Each bomber was individually powerful, but their true strength came from flying together, supporting each other, creating something greater than any individual aircraft could achieve alone. This was perhaps the most profound lesson of the air war over Europe, that American abundance was not just a matter of numbers, but of organization. The United States could outproduce Germany in aircraft and engines and bombs, but more importantly, it could train crews to fly those aircraft in formations that maximized their collective defensive power. Every combat box was a small democracy in the sky, with each crew member depending on every other crew member, and each aircraft depending on every other aircraft. As the American formations approached their targets, the psychological transformation was complete. What had begun as individual bombers trying to survive long enough to drop their bombs had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of warfare. Flying formations that were, quite literally, greater than the sum of their parts. The fortress wall was no longer a metaphor. It was a tactical reality that German fighters found increasingly impossible to penetrate. The irony was not lost on the German pilots struggling to break up these formations. Germany, a nation that prided itself on individual excellence, on ace pilots and technological superiority, was being defeated by American democracy made manifest in the sky. The bombers flew in formations that reflected American values: mutual support, collective defense, shared responsibility. Each gunner protected not just his own aircraft, but every aircraft in the formation. Each pilot flew not just for his own survival, but for the success of the entire mission. In the final analysis, the transformation of the B-17 from individual aircraft to collective fortress represented something larger than tactical innovation. It was the physical embodiment of American industrial democracy, the idea that individual freedom and collective strength were not contradictory, but mutually reinforcing. The fortress wall over Europe in 1944 was not just a military formation, but a statement of principle, that free people, working together, could overcome any tyranny that depended on individual excellence alone. As Lieutenant Rosenthal's formation crossed the German coast on its return journey, he looked back at the contrails etched against the afternoon sky and realized that something fundamental had changed. The Americans had not just learned to build flying fortresses, they had learned to make those fortresses fly together in ways that made them virtually invulnerable. The sky over Europe had become a battlefield where American democracy faced German authoritarianism, and democracy was winning through the simple expedient of mutual support. The German pilots who survived that February morning returned to their bases with a new understanding of what they faced. It was not just superior numbers or better equipment, but a fundamentally different approach to warfare itself. Where German tactics emphasized individual excellence and technological superiority, American tactics emphasized collective strength and mutual support. The fortress wall was not just a defensive formation, it was a philosophy of war made visible in the sky. In the end, the transformation was complete. German pilots who had once mocked American bombers as flying coffins or sitting ducks now spoke of them with something approaching respect, and occasionally, awe. The B-17 Flying Fortress had indeed lived up to its name, not as individual aircraft, but as collective formations that turned the sky itself into a fortress wall that German fighters could break against, but could not break through. The young German pilots who flew against the American bomber streams in 1944 learned that courage and skill, while necessary, were not sufficient against an enemy that had mastered the art of turning individual vulnerability into collective strength. The fortress wall over Europe represented something new in the history of warfare: the triumph of democratic organization over authoritarian excellence, of collective defense over individual attack, of American abundance over German efficiency. And in the contrails that marked their passage across the European sky, those bomber formations wrote a message that would echo through the rest of the war: that free people, flying together, could build walls in the sky that no tyranny could tear down.